Hi everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Gone Too Soon, a place where we celebrate and reminisce on some of the most loved and least existing video game developers of all time. In our first episode, we dipped but a toe into the rich world of the British gaming scene, and while there's still oodles to talk about there, I thought it best we take several plane rides to travel thousands of miles over to Japan. We'll be talking about a studio that I bet you're already nodding wistfully over right now, Clover Studios. They're responsible for some of the most beloved and charming franchises to have come out of Japan in the early to mid 2000s, and while they burned so bright during this time, it's an unfortunate fact that it was also all too brief, or too soon, you know what I'm saying. Before we get right to it, however, the history of Clover Studios, or should I say even the history leading into their very formation, is pretty interesting in and of itself, and to do that, we'll need to start at the end of days, 1999. By this time, Capcom was exploding with franchises and fresh new ideas, capitalizing off the 3D boom just as their 2D boom was beginning to slow down. Primarily bolstered by the success of Resident Evil, the Osaka-based company decided to form one of many smaller subsidiaries that would specialize in certain franchises or genres. This included projects being worked on by such industry legends as Shu Takumi, Shinji Mikami, and the Windex-craving, motorcycle-riding, glasses-loving Hideki Kamiya. The team that's relevant to this story, however, was dubbed Production Studio 4, and their output was maybe even more legendary than the creators themselves. Dino Crisis, Resident Evil Code Veronica, Resident Evil 3, Devil May Cry, Ace Attorney, Dino Crisis 2, the list is extensive and hype as shit. However, even at this early juncture, feathers were being ruffled between the talent and the management. Studio 4 still ultimately had to report to Capcom, and Capcom decided to give one of their upcoming Resident Evil games, then known as RE Last Escape, the numerical suffix 3, much to the chagrin of Shinji Mikami, who was, shall we say, displeased with this turn of events. The title, in the development team's eyes, was developed first and foremost as a spin-off, so Shinji, the producer of the franchise, felt it was unworthy and unfair to suddenly slap a big 3 on there when the game was never intended to carry that expectation on his shoulders. He threatened to quit Capcom over this last-minute mandate, but fortunately nothing came of it in the end. Speaking of big changes, another one was coming up for Production Studio 4 in 2001, just after the release of Devil May Cry, when Capcom announced the Capcom 5, a lineup of exciting titles that would release exclusively for Nintendo's Purple Lunchbox. Well, I guess it was the Capcom 4, since, Dead Phoenix was cancelled, and then there was the PS2 version of Killers, so the Capcom 3, it's the Capcom 1, the Capcom 1. Commercially, all of these titles failed in some way or another, mostly due to their exclusivity on the GameCube, and some due to poor marketing on Capcom's part. Regardless, a lot of the talent at Production Studio 4 was grumbling because while most of these titles were all critically lauded and loved by fans, they felt they were not getting the promotion they deserved. Thus, Capcom decided to appease these superstar creators by giving them even more independence, as the suits at the top were fearing further clashes with the talent, and it might cause them to leave, especially since Shinji had threatened it already and was currently having his own problems trying to get Resident Evil 4 off the ground. This studio was dubbed Clover, an abbreviation of Creativity Lover, whose mission statement was to make games that would stand out amongst Capcom's other output. Therefore, in early 2004, Kamiya, Mikami, and Atsushi Inaba, a longtime producer, became the 3 main creative heads of the studio, with their first project being the PS2 version of Beautiful Joe, oddly enough.
Is this your idea of a date movie? I had a more romantic time eating popcorn in the lobby.
Team Beautiful was simply the moniker Okami and his fellow developers called themselves back when the GameCube version was developed under Project Studio 4. So, Beautiful Joe released on the PS2 in August of that year, almost a year after the original, and while it still maintained the manic comic book Sentai-infused combat and over-the-top boss battles, it also came with a few extras for PS2 fans and any other GameCube owners willing to double dip. Most notably was the inclusion of Dante from the Devil May Cry series, as he makes a playable appearance as an unlockable character. Sweet Mode, an extra difficulty level, was also added, as well as a trailer for Beautiful Joe 2. Also, hilariously, the Japanese version of the game was subtitled as A New Hope, which of course would be immediately shut down if Capcom tried it in North America.
But mate, you better not be thinking you can just hop on the submarine and go straight to our hideout.
Wait. That sub goes to your hideout?
No.
While the gameplay was still fun and slick, Joe's journey on Sony's machine did suffer from some frame rate issues that were not present in the GameCube original, and also lacked progressive scan mode, which produced sharper visuals. This was a common thing for other GameCube games that were ported to the PS2, as they almost always resulted in some technical hiccups. Then, just 1 year later, Joe, Sylvia, Captain Blue, and the rest beautifully returned in the sequel, Beautiful Joe 2, released on the GameCube in November and the PS2 the following month. The game picked up on the ending of the first, making the most of the movie aesthetic by leveraging the idea of sequels, and now featured two playable heroes integral to the plot, Beautiful Joe and Sexy Sylvia, respectively.
Joe and Sylvia, here to save the day.
That is one serious saucer, dude!
The invading baddie, the Black Emperor, turns Captain Blue into an Oscar statue. Literally, they're called Rainbow Oscars, and he needs to collect 7 of them to dominate Movie Land. Ha 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 ha. While lacking true simultaneous co-op, a technical nightmare to balance as all the time and speed powers would need to be shared by 2 players, you could switch between the two on the fly, leading to a lot of variety in the combat and puzzles. While highly entertaining and featuring the same wacky charm as the first adventure, it wasn't exactly doing, much more in terms of gameplay, which is not a surprise as it released so soon after the first. Regardless, Joe 2 reviewed very well across the board, and the small but passionate fanbase for the franchise just gobbled it up. Sales-wise, however, it was a different story. While Beautiful Joe 1 sold fairly well on just the GameCube, Inaba went on to say that the title's small budget made a success, the sequel did worse, barely selling 300,000 copies across both consoles in all territories by the end of Capcom's fiscal year in March of 2005.
So I will kill you! I will! Then, it's sleepy time.
2005 was, as most can attest, a very important year for Capcom in general. RE4 finally released to critical blowjobs from the press, with many lauding it as the high point of the series and a reinvention of action games in general. Unfortunately though, Okami had been producing the title for several years prior before stepping in as a director, so the game's development is not credited to Clover, but rather Production Studio 4. So, shortly after RE4's debut, the legendary team was officially dissolved as it marked the last project they were obligated to finish. Okami then quickly scooped up a team at Clover to work on something very different than the gloomy forests and castles of rural Spain. Anyway, 2005 continued to still be a very henshin a go-go year for Clover, as they released not 1, but 2 Joe-related spin-off games. A little strange considering the lukewarm sales of the sequel, but, fans weren't complaining. While they weren't exactly cheering either, because both Beautiful Joe Red Hot Rumble and Beautiful Joe Double Trouble are considered to be on the lower end of the spectrum of the franchise, with the sales and critical reception kind of, echoing those sentiments. For those not familiar, Red Hot Rumble is a multiplayer Smash-like released on the GameCube in November of 2005, and oddly enough the PSP the following March, completely foregoing a PS2 iteration for reasons I'll go into later, or I'll just go into right now. Despite its much bigger install base, the previous two Joe games all sold better on the GameCube in both Japan and North America, which was enough for Capcom to not even bother this time around. While the earlier description of a Smash-like is the best analogy, it's still not the most accurate. Red Hot Rumble is much more akin to a party minigame that happens to have a competitive fighting element to it. Right when you're about to get the upper hand, boom, really hectic arenas start to never stop assaulting all players with various items, hazards, and winning conditions. This makes Smash, even with all items and stage elements on, still seem like Virtua Fighter by comparison. Rumble still retains the colorful visuals, fun world, and characters, but it sadly didn't make much of an impact, either for Joe or fighting game fans alike. It couldn't really decide whether it wanted to be a party game like, say, Mario Party, or a more competitive affair like Smash or even Power Stone, as there was no option to turn off all the wacky gimmicks. Therefore, critically, it also holds the dubious distinction of being Clover's worst reviewed game. But honestly, if this is the bottom of the barrel for you, it's really not something to be ashamed of. Just a concept that needed a bit more tweaking. Double Trouble, oddly, is basically another core platforming adventure, this time taking advantage of the fresh concept of the Nintendo DS. This picks up with Joe and Captain Blue shooting a new action film, only for a mysterious group of villains headed up by one Hinderella to burst in and grab the movie reels containing this latest dramatic effort. The game mixes things up in two ways, using the Nintendo DS touchscreen to activate new moves like the slide and touch VFX powers, which, as you can see, utilize the DS's dual screens to pretty good effect. The second is that a lot of the game takes place in the real world, well, Joe's real world, and not just movie land. So when the action does take place outside the magic of celluloid, as long as Joe is being filmed by the new V-Cam, he can Sentai to his heart's content. Double Trouble was lauded for its fun design and its new powers that made novel use of the DS, but some criticism was thrown at the technical downgrade the game suffered over the console versions, as well as the decidedly slower pace of the action. There's a trend brewing here, I'm sure some of you have noticed, but sales for Double Trouble followed the dip seen by its predecessors. While no North American numbers are available, Japan's Media Create states that the game sold just 5,000 copies in its first week. Not the most heroic debut on a brand new system at the time was as hot as a red hot kick. It's very clear that Capcom and Clover tried their best to get Joe to that level of their other characters, like Ryu or Mega Man, and between 2003 and 2005, they sure gave it a go. 4 games were released in those 3 years, as well as an anime that was also made available in the West, but the dividends became smaller and smaller with each new bit of beautiful media that came out. Clover, fortunately, wasn't done yet. In fact, their greatest artistic triumph was about to come into full bloom. Hideki Kamiya immediately set to work on a new title after his directorial duties were done on Beautiful Joe 1, with he and his team deciding to make something akin to a nature simulator and were pondering on where to go from there. Their prototype meandered for a bit and featured a somewhat realistic art style, with Kamiya himself saying this version was incredibly boring to play. But the team kept at it, and 3 years later, Clover's magnum opus, Okami, was released on the PS2 in April of 2006. Clover and Capcom had been burned on the sales of their GameCube games for years, so it was decided early on that this, their biggest project ever, could only be played on the most successful console in the world. Kami and his team made a massive, sprawling action adventure, cribbing a lot from Zelda, Beautiful Joe, Devil May Cry, but also had its own fresh set of ideas. It told the story of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, who is tasked with returning life to ancient Japan with the help of the chatty but helpful Isun. Problem though? Amaterasu lost all of her powers, but still needs to vanquish a menagerie of mythical enemies, including the multi-headed Orochi. She can achieve this by whipping around weapons in her mouth, the mirror on her back, or with the mighty celestial brush. An epic tale unfolded as you met dozens of memorable characters, ate lots of food, racked up tons of combos, and explored incredibly beautiful locations. While it maintained a lot of tropes of the genre, it was so fresh and different from the visuals, to the music, to the gameplay, that it stood out from what else was available at the time. Although, maybe at least on the surface, it was a bit too different. In 2006, the gaming industry had seen a lot of changes while Clover had been working away on Okami for almost 4 years. What were some of these changes, you ask? Well... So, despite a torrent of amazing reviews, favorable comparisons to some of Nintendo's best entries in the Zelda franchise, and had an amazingly lush art style, Okami went on to sell 270,000 copies in its first full year on sale. Now, the 7th generation of gaming was a rough transition for a lot of Japanese publishers, with many of them playing catch-up to the West in terms of engine development and the changing tastes of fans. What were the biggest sellers of 2005-2006? Right, well, what was Clover putting out in those 2 years? Yeah, we can see there's a bit of a disconnect there, and this overly violent, desaturated sort of look was still pretty fresh at that time. People weren't sick of it yet. And wait, what? What's that little game down there? Well, it's the last title in Clover's portfolio. Shinji Mikami's follow-up to Resident Evil 4, God fucking Hand. Now, having been a longtime producer of various survival horror games for a decade by 2006, it makes sense that Mikami would want to work on something completely different. And I present to you something completely different. After having a conversation with Inaba about action games and how many of them all seem to emphasize weapons like guns and swords and the like, he wanted to make something that put the emphasis back on hand-to-hand combat, and what better way to do that than with the hand of a god? Mikami and his team, with many of them having worked on RE4 with him, wanted to evolve the beat-em-up genre in a more literal way, simply walking through linear levels and walloping anything that came across the player's path.
Hellish. I prefer super tropical. Your arm is ours!
I bet you're not really popular in hell!
The key laid with making a unique combat system that would constantly surprise the player with increasingly over-the-top, wacky maneuvers, while still retaining some martial arts basics from Capcom's back catalog. God Hand chronicled the, pardon the term, bizarre adventure of Jean, an unscrupulous hero who is the descendant of a bloodline that has the power of a god flowing through their fists. With said fists, he fights all manner of invading demons, alongside the saucy Olivia, part of another family tree that swore to protect the God Hand so that they could continue their fight against the forces of evil. The story doesn't really matter, does it? God Hand was all about Capcom in-jokes, masked gorillas, silly music, corny one-liners, and above all, not to be taken too seriously.
Now, we have 2 of these God Hands to defend.
Huh?
Come on. Olivia! You were worried about me.
Maybe I should have taken care of you too.
In fact, when the first trailer was shown to the public, a few snippets of humor made their way into that video, but those moments got such a strong reaction from fans that Clover doubled down on the humor and ran with the idea for the rest of the developmental period. Now, a running theme with all Clover games by this point, and it's especially true for God Hand, is that the public, and especially North America, didn't quite know what to make of Jean's very odd journey. While sales in Japan bettered Beautiful Joe on the PS2, the game wasn't even a blip on Western shores, and combined with an avalanche of, shall we say, polarizing reviews, thanks IGN, the game's notoriety was short-lived. Fortunately though, it has since reached a cult-like status, pretty much like every other game Clover's ever made. So, with that in mind, and with all the examples of low sales across the board for all these Clover titles, it's pretty easy to assume what happened next. The Capcom suits closed down the studio with little warning shortly after God Hand hit US shelves, except that's not really true. While it's been slightly misreported over the years, the events around Clover's closure are a bit more nuanced. Yes, almost all of their games did fail to make any substantial profit, and it is a business at the end of the day, but Capcom started to make steps to simply reintegrate Clover back into their main R&D teams. However, Okami, Kamiya, and Inaba all just quit the company before that could ever happen. Yeah. Even though they had been given more freedom than ever during their tenure at Clover, all three of them still felt incredibly limited as they still had to report to Capcom at the end of the day. Okami already had been furious over several decisions made by the higher-ups in years past, and felt their titles were not getting the push that more well-known IPs were getting at the time. With no leadership present at Clover, Capcom publicly dissolved the studio and everyone went their separate ways. Some staff opted to remain at Capcom, while a good percentage of others followed Mikami and Inaba, who, after a few months of restructuring, went on to form a little studio called Platinum Games. Much of the DNA we saw from these creators in the past really shone under the luster of Platinum. Devil May Cry and Beautiful Joe's original director, Hideki Kamiya, would sire both Bayonetta and Wonderful 101. Clover's penchant for bold art styles would continue with games like Mad World or Transformers Devastation. It's pretty clear that owning their own company really let these creative minds flourish, because Platinum's portfolio of work simply speaks volumes. Fortunately, however, even Clover's IPs under Capcom still had a presence long after the studio shut down, although it's not exactly equal between all franchises. Beautiful Joe made appearances in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom and was even joined by Amaterasu in Marvel 3 as well. Not only that, Capcom tried their hand at an Okami sequel with Okamiden, which released on the DS at the tail end of 2010 in Japan and March in the following year for the rest of the world. Although not as fondly remembered or reviewed as the original, it at least showed that Capcom had a reverence for these IPs and sees their value, even if there's been no sequels or spin-offs for anything since then. Although, it has been reported that Capcom and Platinum actually came close to putting aside their differences to make a full-on Okami sequel, but that might be a story for another day. You could very well make a case that this was the best outcome for the creative minds and teams behind all these wonderful characters and franchises, as they can now simply pick and choose the IPs and projects that best suit them and their developmental style. While Clover was only in operation for 3 short years, it was an explosion of weird and unique offerings that are still loved and remembered to this day, and it's great to see that same passion continue in another company, proving that while they may be gone in their original guise, they still live on today. Although, I can't help but think of what else Clover could have achieved if they had survived for a few more years, creating even more new worlds or characters, or reinvigorating dormant franchises under Capcom's umbrella. I guess we'll never really know. Well, that's it for this episode of Gone Too Soon, and I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. If you want to put forward the name of another developer you feel should be given the recognition they deserve, drop it in the comments or bounce on over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon to vote on our official polls. See you next time, and thanks for watching.